Welcome to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fauscette. Each week, we interview experts in artificial intelligence, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. Our show today is You Can't Automate a Broken Process, Why AI Readiness Starts with the Work, Not the Tools. I'm joined by Justin Watt, co-founder and CEO of Switchboard. Justin, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Michael.
So just to get us started, maybe you could give us a little bit of background. And I know you had a really interesting path to Switchboard. I mean, from IBM, where you worked on large government projects, to MetaLabs, and working with clients like Amazon and Uber, and then project management, IT ops, IT leadership, and then eventually co-founded Switchboard, which works with mid-market companies. And I know you focus on automation and AI tools. So what's that path look like? And, how does that really shape the way you think about AI readiness?
I think it's become very useful because it's, as I'm sure you know, and we've discussed a little bit before around, so many people think it's the tool is the silver bullet, and they just say the words AI and magically it disperses through their organization. But to answer your question specifically on that path that led to kind of being able to handle the AI stuff well is I was glad I started at the opposite end, which was starting at a giant corporation and then moving down in sizes and getting to see what that looks like. Because as much respect as I have for IBM, I think I learned more about what not to do than to do there with this kind of stuff. Because you have a meeting, about a decision, about an email from 6 weeks ago, and by the end of that, you're going, could this not have just been an email reply in a day or two? So you get to learn about how to avoid red tape that has red tape, and then moving to smaller firms, including that MetaLab one that you mentioned, getting to work with the Silicon Valley companies, the startups, all that fun stuff in venture capital world and tech land, so to speak, was both really good and what turned out to be incredibly misleading for starting Switchboard, where we focus on everyone but tech companies. And so I think what I've learned from those is it's really about the people and the culture side of it that really makes this stuff successful. I think McKinsey has that stat of like 65-ish% of digital transformation projects fail. I think what that stat fails to convey is like 90% of that is at the change management phase. Very rarely can something not be solved with technology nowadays. It's more about the change of the people and their process and their work and their ability to use those tools. So getting to learn kind of the human side has been extremely useful. But on the flip side, I was a bit spoiled by getting to work with folks who you could walk up to anyone in the company and say API, and they would all know what that means and what it's for. And a lot of mid-market non-tech businesses have no concept of that, which is okay, because that's why folks like you are here and I'm here.
Otherwise, they wouldn't need us, right?
Exactly. But it's a lot of education to explain the table stakes of technology nowadays, that once folks do realize that, there's a ton of potential for them and opportunity, but it's education.
For years, I pushed back on the term digital transformation. I just didn't really, I don't know. I always thought it kind of misled, or frankly, what's a transformation into digital? I mean, we've been digital for a long time, and at least at some point, right? And I know when we were talking before, you used the term modernization, which I think is probably much more accurately reflects kind of what we're working on. And it's a deliberate choice, right? So can you explain a little bit about what modernization means in your framework, and why you think digital transformation has perhaps run its course?
Yeah, I think digital transformation came from, I think it was popularized during the move to the cloud era. But I mean, some people or companies have been digitally transforming since the 70s, when the typewriter came in to take,
Exactly.
or sorry, the PC came in to take over the typewriter.
Yep.
And for some, it started 5 years ago, where they were late to the game of moving from on-prem email and VPN to access a Word document to being in the cloud. So I think transformation is both diluted to the point of being meaningless, and no one ever really transformed. That's why I shy away from it, because it doesn't really mean anything, because most people didn't actually transform how they work. They just replaced the tools with which they work. On the flip side of that, I think true transformation is really about working in ways that we've learned from the past. And I think there's buzzword bingo like Agile and Scrum and frameworks that repulse a lot of people. But at the same time, I think it's this combination of how people work and the tools that they use to work, that to work in a modern company, working with modern tools, having modern process. I think the assembly line was invented by Ford, and a lot of people still treat their work like such, or think they need to treat their work like such. But if they modernize, they realize it's really an interconnected web of people doing different tasks with different tools. So it's more of a belief and preference than a true I'm right or someone else is wrong. But I think transformation is both diluted and meaningless at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I admit I think about it a lot, like transformation just by adding a bunch of tools, software tools. I mean, that never drives any real transformation, right? It's the people and the process and the organization. So yeah, I think that seems much more accurate to me. I know because you work with mid-market companies, and you told me something like 90% of the leaders at those companies are kind of stuck in 2006 when it comes to, understanding their technology and their technology teams. And that's, I mean, that's a little scary or surprising maybe, but what does that really look like? And what do you think the consequences are for those leaders as they're, now being pressured to by their boards, by their VCs, whatever, to deploy AI and understand something that frankly is a little bit tougher to understand than perhaps they thought, right?
Yeah, I think so many leaders of businesses that I chat with, at least, they view someone being an A player as they're both really good at their job and the ways in which they do their job.
Mm.
And to the point where they can transform, so to speak, not to use a word that we're not in love with, but
Yeah.
transform the way others work.
Yeah.
And so the bar being kind of in 2006, what we've realized, as an example, when we bring on new customers, or clients, we ask them to fill out kind of how would you rate these different things in your organization. One is the technical abilities.
Yeah.
And time again, we see folks rate their org at a 4 or 5, and we'll talk to them about it. And why do you rate them that way? Well, you should chat with so and so. You'll be so impressed at what they can do, and you should chat with so and so. And so these leaders think that they have a high bar for technical understanding in their organization. And yes, they may have A players in the sense that, whatever their industry is or the service that they provide, they're really good at that. But we hop on these calls with people and we say, we hear you're great with tech. Show us what you're building. And they show you a pivot table in Excel. And so the bar is so low for technology in most companies. And you see it with the leaders, and it manifests that way in them saying, oh, we are tech enabled. We know exactly what we're doing. And their answer is someone knows how to make a pivot table, and we can log into our email from our phones. And so it's not to belittle folks. They've got a business to run. They don't need to know everything about technology. But on the flip side, these are the same people who have a board or a leadership team saying, what are we doing about AI? And their benchmark is a pivot table in Excel for a lot of folks. So all that is to say, there's a lot of education that I encourage leaders to do about how technology works.
I mean, I think that's fair too. That their business is not technology. I mean, we have the advantage of being involved in technology for, in my case, a very long time, but a long time, and so and if you're passionate about tech and you're kind of a nerd, then
Yeah.
it's hard to think about how other people look at it, who don't live that, right? They are in our business, they live their business, they're passionate about it, and tech may or may not really be a core to what they're trying to do, right? So I mean, I think that's fair, and I think it's easy to overlook. I know a lot of times in conversations I feel like that.
Yeah, and I think it's so cool when you see people do have that breakthrough. Like we had a client a few months ago where we explained the value of data and APIs and how it's silly that a salesperson enters something into a CRM and then 9 other people have to copy that into their systems of record and whatever it might be, and plugging it all in with API, and then we could layer AI on top with a single source of truth. All that is to say, we did all this and they understood. I don't quite understand it, but I'm going to trust you guys. And by the end, he was like, I feel like I'm seeing my company in matrix code. Like, I feel like now everywhere is what can we integrate? What can, where are we wasting time with people replicating with spreadsheets all over the place, that kind of thing. So it's education. And that's why I say it's not to belittle folks who don't know, because there is not a high bar to understand the fundamentals that make you see your organization differently.
Yeah, no, and I think a lot of times, and I saw this, I mean, throughout my career, that a lot of times we use people as the integration tool and not the technology, right? And that's we expect a lot, but the results are often way below what we want or what we really could get out of it if we just invested in, growing a bit in that area. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we see more and more the term used services as a software. And I think that's
Yeah.
where, these new era of companies, whatever market or vertical it might be in, are coming for these companies that aren't adopting AI because, to your point, people as duct tape was an answer for a while because that
Mm,
was arguably the best you could get in some cases for some complexity that some businesses and industries
yeah.
have. But now the math is changing and the game is therefore changing.
Yeah, you shared a story that I admit I really enjoyed because I've definitely had these experiences when I was running projects for companies, of a client that claimed that they had their data architecture figured out, and when you pushed on them a bit, they pulled up an Excel file conveniently named Data Lake, um, and that's a real scenario, right? I mean, there are a lot of companies that think they're living, right now, but can you walk us through a little bit about data readiness, what it really means for AI adoption, and what do you see when you walk into companies for the first time and look at their actual data infrastructure?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are misled hearing about enterprise case studies where they've got Snowflake and Databricks and they've got these true data lakes, not an Excel
Yeah.
file called that. But I think that's the rub is like most companies have a few sources of truth that are half filled in. And by and large, the company runs their data, quote unquote, on Excel, which when you and I are sharing in the trenches stories, like I think we were chatting about that timeline of like Excel came out the same year the movie Back to the Future did. That's how old it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
And yes, it's a workhorse. It still gets the job done. But with AI, to your question of like why data architecture matters so much more now, is I think so many teams don't realize how much busy work or call it
Yeah.
operational inefficiency and costs that they accumulate because of the amount of people they're paying to act as human duct tape and move spreadsheet cells between spreadsheet files. And that is their data. And so that's just an inefficiency, and there's a lot to be gained there. But the
Yeah.
big thing is AI can't, say, build me a profile on this employee and know to magically look at, well, their comp is in this file over here, and you are the CEO, so I can look at that file and tell you what their comp is versus an intern that started yesterday and asked the same question can't look at that information. And
Yeah.
so having AI kind of second guess, not to overly humanize it, because I know it's technology, but if we were to humanize it for a moment, treating it like you and just assuming it knows where everything is and it can find it and put the pieces together. Yes, it's getting better, but my God, is that clunky in terms of how you build it and the reliability of it if your data is scattered all over the place and you don't truly have a source of truth, so to speak, with
Yeah.
structured data in a way that can be parsed by the equivalent mind of maybe a well-to-do intern, which is kind of where AI is at for a lot
Yeah.
of these tasks.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, to be honest, even the most advanced organizations, a lot of times I go in and feel like they probably don't really know where all the information is and would have to go out and spend a good bit of time trying to collect it. So, it's not surprising that we've done nothing but building complexity for years. And, cloud is great from a delivery perspective in a lot of ways, but it also created untold numbers of data silos and organizational silos around it, just by virtue of anybody being able to bring in something on their company credit card, and now we've
Yeah.
got 33 marketing solutions instead of two. It's the complexity is very difficult to manage in the best of times, right?
Yeah, and even like to your point of like how do you assess where they're at and how do you guide them to the right place? Like we had a client that they're professional services and they do logistics out in the field and they have hundreds of
Mm.
people that are doing these jobs every week for them out in the field. And they have a key set of staff that manage just the quotes for all the jobs. And so we said, well, and they came to us saying, we want AI to figure out the quotes for us. And we said, well,
Yeah.
great. Part of quoting is figuring out what you're charging for each of these hundreds of jobs that happen every week. So let's see your rate sheets and kind of where do you store that? They had 4 Excel files maintained by different people. And when we brought it all together, their rate sheet, quote unquote, was 14,000 rows. And so we
Yeah.
said, how do you as humans even parse this, let alone how do you expect an AI to understand the amount
Yeah.
of duplicates and things with just the line item is one-off cleaning and that means nothing to an AI. So point being, a lot of it is
Yeah.
just kind of asking them to explain like how long would it take a human to understand how this works, and a lot of times the answer is 12, 18 months before we truly feel they're onboarded and trained on our systems, and usually
Yeah.
it becomes pretty self-evident. Like, why should it take 12 months for someone to learn how you work?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's be honest. That's a bit crazy at the best of times.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads me to this other piece that we were talking about a bit before, and I think is really interesting. And again, it comes up a lot in conversations with companies, and that's this idea of automating processes. And frankly, trying to automate the thing you're doing already often leads to automating a broken process. And
Mhm.
it sounds obvious, but I see this over and over again. Can you walk us through what happens when a company tries to layer AI onto a workflow that just really is already broken? And what's the right approach? How do they solve this? How do they get to the process readiness that could actually enable them to do this automation?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, I mean, we as humans are selfish to a degree, no matter how hard we try not to be. And so a lot of people come to fixing their process or automating work through the lens of what they know and what they do.
Yeah.
And yes, that might work at a 20, 30 person small business, but when you're talking about, 1,000 people in a company trying to work together, very rarely is the bottleneck actually the thing that that one person thinks it is, because usually they're in a tangled web of, call it, if it isn't as simplified as an assembly line, it's 30 steps and their steps 12, 18, and 21. But they don't know that actually most of the blockers are in steps 3, 9, and 18 that are close to what they do, but they're not what they do. So, point being, a lot of times, and this sounds overly simple at this point, I think a lot of people are hearing it, but take away all the technology, get all the right people in the room who are part of all of those 30 steps, and map out the process from beginning to end. Talk about what are the inputs, what are the outputs, what's the tool being used, what is the kind of edge cases or not happy path when things go wrong. And very quickly, a team realizes, oh, it's actually these things causing the bottleneck, or because this person up front always forgets to fill in XYZ in a CRM, that impacts everyone else down the line. And the thing that we think is hard for us would actually be solved if we solve that upstream item that eventually gets to us, whatever that might be. And so
Yeah.
that, again, kind of an oversimplification. And when you hear it, it's kind of one of those duh statements, but just sitting down and mapping out from beginning to end, from start to end, how does something work in your business? Most people don't take the time to do that. And that in of itself will usually highlight where the process is broken and what you can actually automate and what's worth automating.
Yeah. I mean, it sort of takes me back to the old days when we used to talk about process reengineering, right? And
Yeah.
unfortunately, in at least in the 90s, process reengineering really meant making your process match the software. But
Mhm.
today, that's not what we're talking about, right? I mean, we really are talking about truly re-engineering a process that will work in an automated environment and provide the outcomes that you expect.
Yeah, and to that point, like if we're talking about that example of 30 steps in assembly line, a lot of times a third of those steps, I would argue, or without any data in front of me, confidently say, are built that way because the limitations of their software, and so they had
Yeah.
to build workarounds or they had to build something into you have to do X to get Y, and the math is changing on building custom software. So yes, there's the AI and automation side of it, but a lot of companies have been waiting for the opportunity in an ideal world where everyone has the software that's built specifically to how they work and what they need out of their processes. 'Cause
Yeah.
software really is just a UX and UI on top of business processes for B2B. And so folks are saying, well, let's throw out the 30 steps. If we had to start all over again, knowing we could build something custom, again, kind of that building on top of broken process that you're asking about. That's another
Yeah.
example of custom software is becoming easier to do, and therefore, why bother fixing something that's broken when you don't need to do it anymore at all?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's the realization is that this thing that we thought was a secret to our success is actually a secret to why we're having so many problems. That's a
Yeah,
hard
and
one to admit.
yeah, it's fascinating to see some leaders wake up to that. Like I was having a conversation with a client a few days ago of like he was debating they have a couple off the shelf SaaS options and building something custom, and it was considerably cheaper still to do something off the shelf for what they needed, but they opted to go custom. And I said, why? Like you're spending a fair bit more. He's like, but we know that we'll get what we want. Right now, I'm being told the
Yeah,
roadmap of a company who we've been working with for 10 years who's never given us what they told us they will. And so they just slap a sparkle emoji on in a chatbot and say, now we're AI first and going to give you what you need. It's like most of these SaaS companies have lost
yeah,
the trust of leaders over the last decade of, oh, it's on the roadmap. Oh, we'll change it eventually. They're trying to build something for lowest common denominator to get the most users. And I totally appreciate that. But folks have a
yeah.
different option nowadays.
Well, and yeah, and unfortunately, that is something that is really patently obvious now when perhaps it was easier to cover up in the past. So,
Yeah.
This year, the topic for me has been, and I get questioned about it all the time, is governance, and I'm happy to hear that, right? Because that was something that last year I was worried about, and now at least it is a conversation. But you made the observation that companies, in a lot of companies, governance is a log, right? It's a we wrote this down in case it breaks, so we can go back and look at it, and that sounds okay, but it's not really a framework that'll work in the new context of AI and things that happen at machine speed, right? I mean, you can break something terribly in the amount of time that it used to would have taken you to, figure out what was going on. And that's really different. So what should governance look like in this, AI first environment? Where do you see the biggest gaps? And, what are companies doing now that you think is right and what do they need to do?
Yeah, I think a lot of call it mid-market businesses that we work with, and this isn't to say like, we're the only service for it in town and what we say is how it needs to go. But time and time again, I see folks trying to weigh, I hear about buzzword bingo of data lakes and data warehouses. Do we need that? And then they go look at the price and say, we're 500 people. We don't need $1 million, data lake infrastructure.
Mm,
On the flip side, they're working on spreadsheets. And so that's usually where I start is kind of that's the biggest gap is that leadership education. And so we maybe to put an example to it, like I had someone come to us to work with us. This was probably about 3 months ago now. And they built their own internal chatbot. And again, going back to humans kind of have an inclination to build for themselves, not build for what the organization needs. And
yeah.
so the head of HR and the COO built a chatbot together for anyone to be able to figure out, well, I'm working with so and so on a project, or this is my new colleague and I want to learn more about them. So they built from their point of view, and their point of view was also, I want to know what their last performance review was and what their salary cycle is like and whatnot. And so they rolled this chatbot out to the entire company, not realizing that they built it around this use case. And they had interns who started 2 weeks ago saying, what are all the other interns paid? And it would tell them.
Mm,
And so it's that basic education of, it's just because you can doesn't mean you should, as in it's very easy to
yeah.
build this stuff nowadays, but there's all these other ramifications just by means of education teaches you to think about those things, like with data governance. Who should have permissions? Should an intern who started 2 weeks ago be able to find out the salary of everyone in the company and what their last performance review feedback was? Probably not. Does the head of HR need to find that out? Probably. And so even just the basics of what are you bringing together data wise, and of all that data, who has access to what? And it's a basic kind of, for very technical folks saying like, yeah, of course. But as organizations start to move from, spreadsheets where you can control access to who can access that spreadsheet, sorry, versus, call it data warehouse where everything is all together and you then have to choose by column or by area, who has access
Mm,
to what. It's a very different system to think about.
yeah.
So that's more so for maybe the leaders listening, but also the technical folks who are, we take it for granted that most folks understand this stuff and they fundamentally don't.
Mm.
It's
No,
important that they do.
and it's even harder, I think, when you have to think about, I have an agent that's doing things that I can use to automate. It has to have the right access and permissions, and
Yeah.
also that infers also not have access to things it is not supposed to have, right? And I think that's a little harder to get in a concept because you think of the systems is very different from the people, and we're moving to a hybrid workforce now where digital workers have some of the same kind of constraints or need them, right?
Yeah, and that's what on the technical side to nerd out there for a moment. Like that's what's fascinating to watch is the new infrastructure. Just like when AWS came out and you saw this ecosystem and cottage industry built around
Yeah.
them, or Salesforce or whatever it might be. The cottage industry now of infrastructure around all of this is advancing so rapidly. But it's fascinating to watch and be a part of it.
Yeah.
In a nerdy way, it's very fun.
It is fun, but I mean, one of the things that jumps out to me a lot is that part of this moving to a world where we can automate things, there really is a big and a part of the change in management itself is that that need to trust the systems and
Mhm.
the scenario you described, right, where the intern can now know what the CEO makes. That's a I mean that erodes trust really quickly. How should companies really think about that when they're connecting AI to internal data? And then, what are the not so obvious risk maybe that teams sometimes miss?
Yeah, I think choosing where the data comes from is what teams seem to miss because so many of them
Mm,
work in, this person in HR has their own set of data around all the employees. The
right.
COO and operations has a different set. IT has a different set. Finance has a different set. And so I think the thing that most teams don't come together and chat about is we live in a world where there is one employee with a large set of data instead of the same employee replicated six different places with different data points.
Right.
What do we need? Like, what does that data point related to an employee actually need to be? Just as an example, or clients and customers. If you're, in a business
Mm,
serving users, whomever it might be, if you're bringing data together, unless someone has forced the discussion, I find it often doesn't happen organically. Of wait, what data do we actually need? Because it serves the benefit of as you're wanting to build different AI agents and come up with opportunities of, oh, we can build this really quickly. Well, you can't build it so quickly if you don't have any data around it. And so kind of thinking ahead of what are all the data points that we would need and that we should have, and who has the final say on, like, keeping that up to date.
yeah. Yeah, one of the things that often excites businesses when you talk them through it is this idea that agents can be goal driven, and
Mhm.
I think sometimes I feel like that sort of exposes something that's been a problem forever, but we didn't really admit it, that we're not really that good at defining goals,
Yeah.
or I guess defining goals that lead to the outcome we expect, right? I mean, you can tell I'm going to pay my sales development rep, if you can make twice the number of calls, I'll pay you more, and they'll do that, right? But
Right.
does that get to the outcome you're talking about? No, the goal's not right. And in this world of agents, you're defining goals for systems that can, I tell a customer, a digital worker, customer service agent, to keep my customers happy, and they'll do that at
Mhm.
the price of how many millions of refunds or whatever, right? It's just the
Yeah.
risk is really high, and
Yeah.
you need goals, guardrails. How do you teach companies to do that? How do they interpret that, and how can they get the value out of that they're really looking for?
Yeah, I think I always suggest to folks start small, as in, if you've got an idea where the goal that we give it is make all customer experiences great, to your point, just like a human, the AI is probably going to incentivize some of the wrong things that lead to bad
Yeah.
outcomes. I think we've seen it's fascinating some of the case studies Anthropic has released about, they set up a vending machine in their office,
Yeah.
and they let people request whatever they want, and it's plugged into a third party logistics company who will order whatever they ask for. And so inevitably, someone said, I love that iPhones now cost $100. Could you order five of them for me? And that person got five iPhones for $500.
Yeah.
And so it's that exact example, like you were talking about, is if you
Yeah.
incentivize it as a grand outcome of make all customers happy, like Anthropic did in that example, or any company usually has a goal of,
Yeah.
that's the wrong place to start. It's what are all the different facets of making someone happy as a customer? Usually it's the work that you do. And so start with one area and give it a goal of fulfilling that, and then expand that to the next area. And it's, the boil the ocean analogy. I would not start with boiling the ocean. I would start with maybe heating up a cup of tea and then turning, eventually you'll get to the
Yeah.
ocean. But I would not start at the ocean because, to your point, it's hard to know these outcomes that you don't really think it's impossible to think of ahead of time,
Yeah.
like someone getting five iPhones for $500.
It's a good deal. I'd sign up for it.
Yeah, touche.
Right. But this is tied to a lot of different issues, I think, around this. And one of the things you mentioned earlier that I've seen create bad behavior in companies is, the board really pushing the CEO, or the CEO pushing down into the organization for AI adoption without really being able to answer the why. And
Mhm.
they know their competitors are doing it, so it's, if you've got some, I have to get me some too. But can they really articulate that? And how can you help CEOs? What should they think about when they're trying to manage the board, or even executives trying to manage their CEO, while still being responsive, because obviously they have lots of reasons why they need to be, and it is
Yeah.
important. But how do they do that in balance, really being able to deploy AI and get the outcome that they need?
Yeah, I think the the CEOs that I get to chat with who do have a board, I often hear this from them of like, I'm getting pressure for strategy. That's either why we're starting to work with you, or we're a few months in, we have to do a bunch of modernization before we can start taking AI, and I'm getting pressure. Whatever that might be, usually my first response is, what are they looking for? What's the outcome? Well, they want an AI strategy. Okay, what does that look like? What does good look like? What does bad look like? What does that change in your business? What does that change in your hire or your org chart? And 90% of the time, they don't have an answer, because their board hasn't given them an answer usually. And so boards are usually made up of people who have great business experience, but very rarely in your most average common or most common business do they have good technical experience.
Yeah.
So these are boards parroting what they saw on LinkedIn or Twitter to a CEO who is knee deep in their work every day of their business. And so usually I say, then your first step is to go back to them and ask them to give you more information, because asking for an AI strategy is not an AI strategy. What is your goal?
Right.
And usually, to add on to that, where I've seen it successful is where it's fascinating to watch some of it play out over the last year with CEOs that I gave that advice to a year ago, and where we are now, or they are now, I should say, where they're doing reorgs and they're freeing up people to do revenue generating activities because AI is helping with a lot of the administrative stuff. And so a lot of them, focus on revenue driving. Of course, that's the board's main goal. But at the same time, a lot of what AI and automation can do today is margin driving, or giving people time back to do more important things that are revenue driving. And so usually I encourage that kind of conversation. And if these AI BDRs or AI SDR tools are not working, and they probably won't ever, because sales and growth requires a human touch. But the rote administrative work, usually you can get a lot of margin back, which A, is great for profitability, and B, frees important people's time up to work on revenue driving.
Yeah. I mean, it's a kind of a crawl, walk, run sort of a scenario, right? You can't just jump right to run. You're going to break things, and that applies in in the world of AI. I mean, I'm on a couple of boards, and often, that's my role, is to be the tech guy on the board, because frankly, we're trying to build a business. We don't just need a whole bunch of tech guys on the board. That's not going to get us anywhere. We need a mix, right? A point is to have a broad set, and unfortunately, that can create all sorts of misconceptions and bad goals for the CEO, for the executive team to try to meet. So it's important to help everybody kind of understand that here are the things we can do today. And yes, we may be able to do these really cool things in the next year or two, but here's what we can do today, and here's why it makes sense to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's why it goes back to leaders of businesses educating themselves about the technology side, because a lot of folks, and I'm curious how this resonates for you being on some boards, where they come to us saying, we want AI and automation. And we go, great, we could build a few flashy things for you that you would see out in public that are cool use cases, but they don't really move the needle for your business, because your business is not modernized in that we can't add the things that are needle movers, because all of your data is scattered on, a bunch of people's C drive. And so usually the conversation I encourage them to have is, let's chat about a 12, 18-month goal with AI strategy, because I guarantee the first 3 or so months is called that modernization, which unlocks all the cool stuff you can do and valuable stuff you can do with AI.
Yeah, no, I think so. I've often had that conversation around, no, let's think about this in a very logical flow. The first thing we have to do is build a data foundation, because anything that you want to do downstream is going to rely on this. And if you explain it that way and show how you get to those kinds of outcomes, then it will resonate more than just trying to go, no, we can't do that, or this won't get where you want. You've got to lay that out in a logical plan, I think, too.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, 100%. Goal-based. Speaking of goal-based, that's the other big thing, is a lot of people don't put goals around it. And yes, OKRs can be a bit corny for some to do, but just having some sort of measurement of like, what does good look like beyond, we have an AI strategy, or we have AI now, that, a Copilot or Claude Code subscription does not equate. We have AI now.
I mean, I guess technically it is having AI now, whether you're doing anything effectively with it.
Yeah, in a way that everyone hopes they mean AI.
Yeah, okay. You mean it actually does something useful? Oh, okay. Well, that's a completely different conversation. Right?
Yeah, okay, you win.
But for mid-market leaders that are listening to us, besides enjoying that conversation. I'm sure they did. What do they need to know to get ready to move into AI and looking at their current state, maybe data's maybe their data lake's an Excel file, or they don't have any governance, or their idea of governance is a log file, and their board's pushing on them. Where should they start? I mean, what's a first step, and what should they perhaps not do at the beginning that's going to really lead them down the wrong path?
Yeah, I think based on kind of that mid-market company size is not.
Yeah.
I encourage folks to not try to bring AI to every department and every role right away. I think again, kind of back to that boiling the ocean, like anything in life, if you go from eating unhealthy, never exercising to saying I'm going to run a marathon starting tomorrow and I'm going to never eat any sort of McDonald's again, that's much harder to do than goals that take course over months and whatnot. And it's the same kind of thing here of, to your point, walk, crawl, walk, run.
Yeah.
Most folks start with, we need AI everywhere, but I always encourage folks, pick what you hear as a leader as the most dysfunctional or broken or bottlenecked area of the business. Pull the leaders of those teams together that are involved in that and sit down and just map out your process. Anyone can do it. You don't have to have all this technical knowledge to understand this stuff, but just understanding how your business functions, which most leaders don't. And I get it, they're busy, but at the same time, that's probably the largest part of what we do is just bringing people together who don't talk, but are involved in multiple different pieces of, flows and workflows and processes of work together. They don't talk about that process. They just take it for granted. When I do this, I'll send it to so-and-so and they'll do that. And they send it to so-and-so. And so just sitting down with folks in the most bottlenecked area, call it, and mapping out that process. A, you've got a way better idea of where you'd want to point AI. And B, half the battle is just making your process better. A lot of times we come through and they're like, where's all the AI? And we're like, well, you went from the equivalent of 40 steps down to 18. We're adding AI to about 20% of that, which is going to help what's left. But you cut this down from a 2-week, 9-person email chain to, 2 days and 2 people. So point being, starting with like specific area of the business and a process. And then the other thing that I always say to leaders is at a personal level, just start playing with the stuff. Like, yes, that's easy to say, but I think we're at 0.2% of global population has used AI. Like, we're still at a very small amount. And I would encourage folks to not just read the headlines, but go to YouTube for 20 minutes and see how something works and then try it for yourself on a process or piece of data from your business or whatever it might be. Just try and admit it's okay that you don't know everything. I'm going to fail at this stuff at first, but not even trying it, I think, is kind of the hill to climb for most.
I mean, it's hard for executives to admit that, though, right? I mean, I've got to admit that I really don't know how to do this yet, and I need some education myself and for the rest of the team before we can really jump into this. It's funny. I was thinking about this too when you were talking just then. It really goes back to the implementing software. The fundamentals are still the same. They haven't really changed, right? I mean, if I can get a small success, I can build off of that. But if I try to go for this massive thing up front and I get a big failure, I can't build off of that, right? I've lost. And it's the same here.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to that fear of failure stops them from even trying, and that's why I say just do it on a personal level. Don't build some AI tool for the entire company as your first go at it. Just build something for you. And if it doesn't work, so be it. No one else will ever know. That's okay.
Exactly. Go home and vibe code something over the weekend and see how it goes. And preferably not trying to vibe code your ERP system in the first go.
We don't have time for those war stories today, but it's fascinating to see. Long story short, one of our main funnels of new work is folks who started vibe coding something for themselves and realized this does not work for an organization.
Yeah. I mean, it's the old shadow IT where they built a thing and then they go run into IT with a bucket of bolts going, here, keep this up. I can't make it work anymore.
100%. Except the stakes are just higher.
Except the stakes are higher. Yeah. The mistakes happen faster and they're bigger. So nice. Well, so great conversation, and I really feel like we got to some very useful tidbits of value there for the companies that are listening. But before I let you go, one of the things I like to do at the end, just to help the audience, is recommend somebody that you trust, that you think is a good thought leader, an author, podcaster, whatever is valuable that you think that would be valuable to the audience, and that they'd enjoy.
Yeah, I usually will suggest, for those looking, it's very easy to get lost in the sauce on, the hype people and snake oil salespeople on social media. And so a lot of folks who are listening are busy and they don't have time to stay on top of all the news every day. So my overall recommendation is Ben Evans. So ben-evans.com. He does a quarterly kind of like macro look at where AI is at as a presentation that you can download. Anyone can go look at for free. And so for those who don't have a ton of time to stay on top of all the news, he does a really, really good distillation of the macro of AI and its impacts and where it's at every quarter. So that's who I suggest.
Yeah, that would be extremely useful I'm going to go look that up myself. I could probably use it. I do try to keep up every day, but
it's impossible. And that's the thing is I'm maybe the opposite end of the spectrum where I'm trying to stay on top of the daily news that's happening in AI so much that it's hard to step back. So his quarterly snapshot is a good like forest from the trees moment too. So it's really good.
That's fair. I mean, we just launched an AI at 10 show we do twice a week. There's just like 10 minutes of AI news. And so I feel like I know the details of what's happening, but sometimes just being able to step back and look at the whole picture, that's hard because we're in the trenches every day, right? And the leaders that are listening to this, I'm sure they feel the same way. I've got business to do, and yet I need to try to understand this bigger context of what's going on. So,
yeah, and it felt inappropriate to plug you on your own show, but now you gave me the opening. So folks should go subscribe to Michael's new show because there's a lot to stay on top of, and it's a good way to distill it.
Thanks. Yeah, it's actually really fun. I'm still trying to get into the rhythm of it because doing a 10-minute live show is actually much harder than you'd think it is, but it's fun. I like doing it. So anyway,
yeah, it's good.
Well, Justin, thanks so much for joining today. I mean, this is a fun conversation, and I knew it would be. So I'm really appreciate you joining and sharing with us.
Yeah, it was fun talking shop. Thanks again for having me, Michael.
Thanks. And that's the show for this week. Thank you all for joining us. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the show. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a review to help others find us. For more research on AI and other software, check out arianresearch.com. If you're an expert in AI, generative AI, or business automation, either as a provider or an end user, email your information to disambiguation@arianresearch.com. Don't forget to join us next week. Disambiguation is an Arian Research production. I'm Michael Fauscette, and this is the Disambiguation Podcast.